Well, you two have given Matt a great couple of days, haven't you?
He's happy in his hole.
What you got, Matt?
Well, we've put this section through the leat area here, and you can see this kind of brown silt fill there, and then we've got these clay bands, the blue clay and the yellow clay bands, but I mean, that's about it really.
While our early medieval mill is condemned to the clay, at the cockpit of Buck Mill, Tracy has had what can only be described as an archaeological epiphany.
Well, yeah, I had a real Agatha Christie moment earlier on.
Come on, give us your moment.
Well, we have the strange tale of the broken clasp, the smashed teacup and the careless smoker.
Recount the story to me.
Well, we got down to the bottom of the cockpit yesterday.
Yeah.
And we've got a really well rammed in stone floor down there.
Yeah.
Underneath the floor, just at the point where it was being laid, we found this. It's mid-17th century and would have been some sort of dress fastening.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody's been standing up here, this is broken off and fallen down. They haven't found it. They've carried on laying the floor, so that gives us a really nice date for the laying of the floor. Then straight away, when the floor has been laid, before anything's built up, no silting or anything like that, we have a chappie, he's smoking his pipe.
This is the careless smoker?
This is the careless smoker. And he's smoking his pipe and he's dropped it and he's smashed it.
Why is he careless?
Well, you can't have a naked flame in the flour mill because the flour will just combust and boom, bang goes your mill. So the only time he could have been smoking was when they were building the walls. But then, unfortunately, the same poor chap, he's had his cup of tea and he's smashed his teacup.
And what sort of date is this?
The cup dates 1660 to about 1680, so that ties in really nicely with the clasp and gives us a good dating for the construction of the first phase of this part of the mill.
So very possibly thanks to John Bengerfield and his Butterfingers, we now know that the earlier phase of the mill was built between 1660 and 1680. Bill has finally solved the problem that's been giving him a headache: how the water was brought to the mill wheel during the 17th and 18th centuries, when a much wider water wheel was in use.
It's been a real archaeologist's trench. It's been really challenging. It's been wonderful.
What was the challenge?
Well, what we really wanted to try and do was try and establish whether or not there had been a wide water wheel in here before the narrow metal one. Now, to put that metal wheel in, you have to block off this wide opening. And so what I really needed to do was actually find the proof. And the proof is in here. We started at the top and we began to realise that this was actually part of this big blocking. And originally we thought it came to here. We thought this was going to be a major stone wall. But the crucial bit of the jigsaw was taking off all the limescale that covered this part of the wall. And you can see here, actually, now I've got rid of the limescale, that there's a joint running up through here. This is part of this major wall that runs down here. All of this is blocking that was put in when they put the metal wheel in.
So what does that tell us about the history of the wheel and the wheel pit?
Well, it seems that we had a wide wheel working off a lesser head of water. And later on, in the quest for more power, more productivity in the mill, they put in a bigger water wheel, an overshot wheel, and that way, by raising the head of water, by embanking the pond and getting a bit better head of water coming into the wheel pit, they could put in a narrower water wheel.
So it was more powerful because the water was coming from higher?
Absolutely right. With an overshot wheel, you've got the best arrangement.
And because of our archaeologists' detective work, we now have a pretty good idea of what Buck Mill would have looked like right back to the 17th century. This earliest phase of mill could have been built by John Bengerfield between 1660 and 1680, at which point the mill would have had a much wider water wheel. In the 18th century, another pair of millstones were added. Around the 1830s, the more primitive wooden wheel would have been removed and replaced by the cast iron overshot wheel, which required fundamental changes to the water supply and wheel pit. Buck Mill had a leat bringing water from the stream over a mile up the valley. So it would have been a remarkable feat of engineering that supported not only generation after generation of miller, but the entire community around them.
We've certainly got to the bottom of the side of the altar, and I'm pretty much getting towards the base of the front of it. It's a surface, but it's characterised by masses and masses of quartz pebbles.
So do you think they're a surface as opposed to offerings inside the altar or beside the altar?
That might be some sort of a floor.
So that's much more architectural, which is, I think, what's actually happening in here as well. They seem to be using, again, these angular bits of quartz, and they're putting them around the inside of the kist, and they've formed like a little box. And inside it was a lot of the soil. You can see here it's charcoal flecked brown, but it comes also down onto this very yellow clay, and that's where I'm stopping. It's almost like, instead of using like a wooden box and putting it in there, they've used these to construct the box to contain something like relics.
Now, one thing that's been nagging me since day one is that. Do you think that that stone's got anything to do with your box?
What I can say is that the dimensions fit.
Well, it would actually
It
slide
would
in here.
literally just slide right here. And if this Keeill became less important over time, those relics may have been taken somewhere else. That would explain why this has been disturbed and then sort of put into the wall area that we can see now in this collapse.
Well, logically, I suppose if they were going to empty that out, they got to take that out first.
It would be the first thing to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What venerated objects were in this quartz-lined box, we can now only guess at. But they lay at the east end of a chapel where priests once worshipped on a quartz floor and prayed at a carefully constructed stone altar. And all this inside the stone and turf-walled Keeill the Vikings built on a 500-year-old Christian cemetery, which itself occupied a burial ground that had already dominated the Manx landscape for over a millennium. After 3 days' hard work, we've now got only one mystery outstanding, and it just happens to concern one of the most important discoveries we've ever made. All day the team have been on tenterhooks to see if we might get a translation of the Ogham script, and Helen and Dawn have been on the phone to Scotland.
Yeah, Kate Forsyth at University of Glasgow. She's the national Ogham expert, and she can actually read it.
It's Gaelic, and it dates to the 11th century. And Gaelic is, of course, the language of the Scottish Isles and of Ireland, and eventually of the Isle of Man.
Well, what it seems to be is this word apparently means corner. I'll just leave you with that.
Corner?
And then I'll go into the more exciting stuff. Yeah, this is back for corner. Now this says Okoikat, which apparently means 50. And this says Ial, which means apparently group, gang, throng, maybe group of warriors, something like that.
This dates to the 11th century, which is a really interesting period in the history of the Isle of Man. And in 1079, a man called Godred Crovan captured the island and established the Kingdom of Man and the Isles. He had been a mercenary at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, fighting for the Norwegian king. And he establishes the kingdom of this island. And the idea that this records 50 warriors, potentially, that came here in the 11th century, which was a small community, I mean, that would have had a serious impact.
Look at his face, he hasn't said a word.
I'm still stunned. There's so much to take in. There's so many possibilities about what it might mean. And there's the whole issue of who is it who's speaking this or writing it.
Yeah.
It's the first time that we get that language here on the Isle of Man so early, as far as I'm aware of.
So this could be the first writing in Gaelic
Yeah.
that's been found on the Isle of
Yeah.
Man.
And this is almost a casual, personal bit of stuff. And for me, that makes it that much more important that it's somebody speaking to us almost directly.
That's incredible, really.
Who carved this message and what they truly meant by these words will keep archaeologists debating for years.
Gang.
But we've discovered so much about a site that only 3 short days ago was just a landmark on a golf course. It's amazing to think that in the past you might have seen early Christians here and Viking warriors and medieval priests, all of whom left rare pieces of evidence. And maybe we've shed some light on a history that began to be written in these words 1,000 years ago. You're going to stay here till the bitter end tonight, aren't you?
Oh yes, because we must see the finale.
As we race to make sense of the barrow or mine or whatever it might be, the bigger picture is beginning to take shape. Sometime about 6,000 years ago, people came to Blackpatch. They sunk mines in search of flint and used that flint to clear the trees. After mining drew to a close, this became a sacred place. About 4,000 years ago, our ring barrow was built and ritual pits placed around it. 1,000 years later, Blackpatch became what it is today, a place of settlement and farming. When I was up here 2.5 days ago, I thought that I was going to be looking for a Neolithic residential site with a few flint mines attached, but it seems to have got more and more complex as the dig's gone on.
They're very difficult sites to sort out, flint mines. People, I think, are coming here to mine flint, but it's not just purely an industrial activity, it's a big communal activity. And when they're here, they're not living here for like generation after generation and for hundreds of years.
So when John Poole said that what we'd got here was a Neolithic settlement, he was wrong, wasn't he?
No, he hadn't. He came and he saw pits, which he interpreted as being dwellings. He was absolutely right. At Myrtle Grove, that's what we've got. We've got dwellings of the Bronze Age period. He didn't know it was the Bronze Age period. In fact, at that time, the distinction between the Bronze Age, the Iron Age and the Roman period was all conflated anyway. And with all the science and 50 or 60 years worth of advancement of knowledge in archaeology, we're still struggling to answer the questions he asked.
We're certainly struggling to make sense of the ring ditch.
The bottom isn't very deep.
We've hit solid chalk beneath our stash of flint, which means it's not a 6-metre deep mine. But if it's not a mine, what is it?
I mean, that's weird, isn't it?
It is. It's curious to think what this might be. I mean, it's really this whole central space within the ditch. And the only other feature within the interior is this very sort of irregular tree flow hole.
But no burials?
No burials.
I mean, over there, in the flint mines, they're digging holes and they're getting flint out. And here, they're digging holes and they're putting flint back. It's almost as if it was some form of a burial, of a ritual, of offerings. And then you get the ditch goes around the outside and it sort of bounds this sacred area, and then you get those commemorative pits.
Indeed.
I think it's fantastic. Can you think of another one?
No, it is unique.
So this barrow wasn't built to honour the dead, but to honour the two things that dominated prehistoric life here on Blackpatch Hill: flint and trees. It was flint that brought people to Blackpatch, and flint that helped them to clear the trees and shape the world around them.
But if he hadn't done all that stuff, we wouldn't be here.
No. In just 3 days, we've begun to unravel 3,000 years of history. A process begun by one man, John Poole. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks ever so much for all the work that you've done over the last 3 days. But before we go, there's one small presentation that we have to make to Phil. Can you take your hat off, please? You'd forgotten, hadn't you?
Oh, totally.
Ta-da!
God.
Neolithic man. Everything that we've done over the past 3 days has been inspired by John Poole's work. And it's nice to think that we've added yet another chapter to his history of Blackpatch Hill. But it's strange, isn't it, that a story that began 80 years ago with the discovery of a flint mine should have ended with evidence of almost the opposite process: people taking the mined flint and putting it back into the ground.
Hello, my name's John Gator. Time Team is fan-funded by Patreon. This vital support helps us to make new episodes. Joining Patreon gives you access to exclusive interviews, 3D models and masterclasses, plus lots more.